Hello everybody, Mr. Quick here. Today we're going to be looking at Eureka Math / Engaged New York Math, Module 3, Lesson 5, the opposite of a number's opposite. Now, here's the thing. This concept is fairly easy, but what it also can be is it can be a little confusing. When we say the opposite of a number, forget all this other stuff here. Opposite of number, if we have -5, we know the opposite is then 5. If we have 6, we know the opposite is -6. Except now, we're not just talking about the opposite of a number, we're talking about the opposite of a number's opposite. So if we have -6, the opposite then becomes 6. Well, if we're saying the opposite of a number's opposite, we want the opposite of 6, which is then -6 again. So easy concept, but also can be confusing, I get it. So let's go through some examples together. Okay, what is the opposite of 8, and how can we illustrate this number on a number line? That's the question we're being posed. What number is 8 units to the right of 0? Well, if we look at the number line down here, this is where we're at, and we go 8 units to the right, we're starting at 0. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We see that 8 units to the right of 0 is 8. Positive 8, I don't need to write anything, I just write the number 8. How can you illustrate locating the opposite of 8 on this number line? Well, if we went 8 to the right to find 8, the opposite would be to go in the other direction, right? I should say correct so I don't confuse you. Go in the other direction, which would be to go left 8 units. So if we go left 8 units, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, we end up at -8. So the opposite of 8 is -8. So going by that same process, it says, locate the opposite of -8. What's the opposite of -8? Well, we went to 8, which was 8 spaces to the right. The opposite of 8 was -8. So then the opposite of -8, since -8 was 8 spaces to the left, would be to go 8 spaces to the right again. So the opposite of -8 is 8. So the opposite of a number is the original number. And that is the number sign, not a hashtag in this case. So when we say, what is the opposite of 8? Well, the opposite of 8 is -8, so the opposite of -8 is 8. So, a lot to say, right? The opposite of 8 is, it's 8. It's the original number. Okay, another concept we need to look at is the symbol, which looks like a negative symbol, right? It indicates the opposite of a number. So, showing that, -5 is the opposite of 5, but, so we don't confuse -5 with just the opposite of 5. If we're going to say negative, we'll put a symbol. If I want to say the opposite of 5, I might put the 5 in parentheses like this, right? And so that means the opposite of 5. If I wanted the opposite of -5, I start with the number I have, which is -5, put it in parentheses, and then I'm going to say I want the opposite of that, which in that case it would be +5, right? So let's go down the line here. What is the opposite of -6? So if I was going to write that, I'd take the number that I have, the -6, and I'm going to say, what is the opposite of that? Well, the opposite of -6 is +6, or just 6. Next question. Things get a little more tricky. A little trickier, man. All right, what is the opposite of 10? So I'm going to take my 10. I'm going to put it in parentheses. And I'm going to say the opposite of 10, but we don't want the opposite of 10. We want the opposite of 10. So I'm adding more parentheses. So we have 10, -10, +10. The opposite of 10 is 10. So every row out you get, you change the value. You change the, not the, I'm sorry, not the value. You change the, whether it's positive or negative. So we have negative 5, and then we move out to the next set of parentheses, which means the opposite, and that's positive 5. So we end up with 5. Here we had 10, and if it was the opposite of that, we'd have negative 10, but it's the opposite of that, so we have positive 10 again. And if we had said, what is the opposite of the opposite of the opposite, and we had to go out again, we would have negative again, right? So it just changes every time. So how would you write the opposite of negative 12? Well, again, we start with the number they give us, so negative 12. I'm going to put that in parentheses. The opposite of negative 12, I'm going to add that here. But then we want the opposite of the opposite, so again, I'm going to add another set of parentheses right here. So again, here I have negative 12. If it was just the opposite, it would change to positive. But since we have the opposite of the opposite of the opposite, or the opposite of the opposite, we move out again to the next line, changes back to negative. So the opposite of negative 12 is negative 12. If that's confusing, you can always do a number line, right? We'll say 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Didn't think I was going to quite make that. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So we'll do negative 2, negative 4, negative 6, negative 8, negative 10, negative 12. Well, if it wants the opposite of negative 12, we're starting here. The opposite of negative 12 is 12, but the opposite of the opposite goes back to negative 12. Okay, kind of gives you like a football looking symbol there. All right, so what does this symbol mean? It can mean negative or opposite. It can mean both things, right? And they're essentially the same. Okay, let's go through a couple more examples, and then we'll have at it in class. Okay, it says complete the table using the cards in your group. Well, we're going to go with what they've given us here. So we have 4 names, and then we have a card, and it just happens to have a number that goes along with it, right? They've given us an integer. So what it wants us to find is the opposite of that card, and then the opposite of that card. So it says the card is A, then it's giving us our equation, which it also is giving us the integers of which to replace A. So it's giving us the value of the variable. So for one, we have 4. So if we're going to say the opposite of 4 is negative 4. The opposite of the opposite, so if we have 4, and then we're going the opposite of 4, and then the opposite of 4 is going to be positive 4. Down here, we have 150. Well, the opposite of 150 is negative 150. But the opposite of that, the opposite of 150, would just be positive 150 again. Opposite of negative 6, 6. The opposite of negative 6 is negative 6 again. Opposite of negative 9 is positive 9. The opposite of that, which is the opposite of the opposite, is negative 9 again. So if it asks us once again to write the opposite of negative 10, it's asking for us to write it as an equation. I'm going to start with my number, negative 10. Put that in parentheses. It wants the opposite of that, so I'm going to highlight that so I can keep track of where I'm at. I've already written my negative 10. I'm writing the opposite, so that means the opposite of negative 10. But now it wants another opposite, so I'm going to add another layer of parentheses. So my equation, since we're writing an equation, we have to have an equal sign, right? I'm starting with negative 10, so I know it's negative. I go out to my next layer of, so like I have this layer here, and then I'm going to go out to my next layer of parentheses, and I know the opposite of negative 10, it would change it to a positive. But now we're going to go out one more layer, which changes it back to a negative. So my final answer is the opposite of negative 10 is negative 10. All right, that's a lot. And again, I think the concept is easy. I think it can be confusing because it's a lot of trying to keep track of, wait, the opposite of the opposite of the opposite of the it's positive and it's negative, and then it's all that. So there's a lot to it. But we'll continue to work on this in class and look at some other examples together. I hope this video has helped. Otherwise, we'll talk to you later. Thanks for watching.